the community colloquium, it's a hard word to say. But it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Dave Tilman today. Dave is not a stranger to the Bren School. He's been here many times over the past few years and has given several talks. But I'm delighted to say that it's the first time we get to introduce him as a member of the Bren faculty. And Dave is an amazingly accomplished ecologist who's won that every award in ecology, I think more than every award the ecologists can possibly win. And he's done a real diversity of research across an amazing array of topics. Last year, as you know, he talked about recent studies he's done in food security and meeting the demands of the global food demand for the next 50 years. He's done a lot of work in terms of issues related to the ecology of biofuels and a whole variety of different kinds of topics along these lines. But one theme that's been throughout a lot of this research has been issues related to biodiversity. And this goes back to his early work where he did some of the most foundational work in terms of thinking about how competition between species actually sets the size of the number of species we see within particular places, so that underlying ecological processes that regulate biodiversity. And since then, though, he's been doing a lot of work, which is what he's going to talk about today, in terms of thinking about more of the functional roles of biodiversity. And so although he's gone off into a whole variety of other kinds of topics over the years, one common theme has been looking at the long-term functional roles in biological diversity. And that's what he's going to talk about today. David.
It is a pleasure to be here and be speaking with all of you, although I'm just escaping a really warm Minnesota winter, so it's not, it is a true pleasure. So I want to talk about biodiversity, and I think it is what humans are doing to the world's biological diversity, I think is as serious, and perhaps in some ways a more serious issue than what we're doing with climate. I'd hate to have to fight between these two incredibly important and very harmful things that we're doing, so I'm not going to make that point anymore. But I just say that because I think that, as you'll see from what I'm going to present, there are an incredible number of things that the diversity of the world, the biological diversity of the world does for society. And these are very recently discovered, and I would assert by most people in society, greatly underappreciated. And I would assert that what I'm going to show you is our series of very general phenomena that we expect to apply not just to systems where they've been studied, but to all systems. And I base it upon sort of a little middle digression into the evolution of life on Earth. A short one to explain to you why life is the way it is, and why that gives us the effects of biological diversity that we do see. So here there's lots of species. We don't know how many. We counted about 3 million. Conservative estimates are 5 million. Some people say 10 million. I don't know. But the Earth is an amazingly diverse place. And as Steve said, one of the first issues that intrigued me was how it could be that so many species, all of which, or many of which, like all the plants, 400,000 or so species of vascular plants, they all require light and water and nitrogen and phosphorus. They interact with each other. How could these things coexist? And I'm going to condense the first 20 years of my life down to this slide. Or maybe one more. Basically, how do all these things coexist? Why has the world gone from having basically one species 3.5 billion years ago, the first thing that appeared, to having so many species now? Well, the explanations we have say that there are multiple things that limit the growth rate, the fitness of individuals and species. Nutrients, light, so the things compete for, diseases, herbivory, predators, things which eat them, etc. The Earth is not a homogeneous place. The Earth is variable from point to point and from time to time. And when organisms are dealing with these various factors that constrain their reproductive output and constrain their population size, they face trade-offs. You're doing a trade-off right now. You're here and not someplace else. A time trade-off, right? All of us face trade-offs throughout our lives. I like to describe this as somebody who says my life studying trade-offs and trying to live it as if there weren't any. But there really are. And so lots of these trade-offs have been studied by ecologists. So plants that specialize in living on low levels of nitrogen have to have higher levels of phosphorus and potassium and water, etc. There are trade-offs involved in one nutrient versus another, in light versus nutrients. The trade-offs between being a good competitor or being resistant to disease or predation, and so on. They're all across the food webs of life on Earth. And if you take mathematics for these kinds of trade-offs, they predict coexistence. This is a very simple curve. For any economist might recognize this. If you took a general ecology class, you might recognize this. If not, all I'm going to say is that it illustrates a trade-off. It says that there are two species here. One is better at living on and growing on low levels of one resource. The other is better at doing that on the other resource. With that kind of a trade-off, these two species can coexist. Each is something it's better at, something it's worse at. It tends to inhibit itself when it grows by driving down the resources it needs, and it inhibits itself more than it inhibits the other species. That's sort of the verbal statement of what allows things to coexist. Now we've tested these. I did that initially on algae. We tested them for algae. I did it for freshwaters. People have looked at marine algae, freshwater zooplankton, marine zooplankton. We've now looked at terrestrial vascular plants. And the only point I want to make for this slide is we published papers in good journals which show that when you know the requirements of individual species and the trade-offs they have, you can predict which ones should win and which ones should coexist. And in fact, that is what happens. In this case, with these prairie grasses, the predicted winners are the species which have the lowest requirements for nitrate and light. It's like grass panicum, another grass Phytacurium. And in a 11-year competition experiment, as predicted, they coexisted, and they drove, also as predicted by these lines there, which I don't have time to explain, the resource requirements, they drove the other two species extinct. So trade-offs allow species to coexist. Species which don't have those trade-offs, like those two species with higher lines that went extinct, go extinct. Now, I mentioned that there are lots of limiting factors in nature. I hadn't mentioned this since we did this work at Sedgwick Ranch, which is a beautiful reserve site that the university has about 30 or so miles from here. I did this with a student of mine, Stan Harpel, published it in Nature in 2007. And we looked at what happened when you added more of various limiting resources. And for that system, we found that there was limitation by nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, and potassium. And we added 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these at a time into randomized plots. And what we found, and when you add one of these resources, you make it so that no longer is limiting to species. You basically get rid of one of these trade-off axes. It doesn't matter how good you are using a resource which is added in high abundance. All that matters then is how good you are using the other resources. And what we saw is as we eliminated each of these kinds of limiting factors, we simultaneously eliminated plant species. Diversity dropped in a straight line linear manner as you got rid of these various limiting factors. So this is reinforcing the statement I initially made. So if you look at the world, going back to the earliest fossil records to the present time, except for mass extinction events, many of them caused by meteor impacts, some may be caused by massive volcanism on Earth, diversity has been basically increasing through time. 3.5 billion years of more and more species on Earth. Well, what does that mean? That only can happen if more species form and go extinct. And that must mean that when a new species forms, it doesn't necessarily displace some similar species, some species that's similar to it in nature. And I saw this first in an experiment we had done where we added seed of many different species to savanna grasslands. This is not Sedgwick, this is now Minnesota. We have very amazingly similar looking savanna grasslands in Minnesota as to the ones in California. Which is one reason we came out here, to try to do a comparative study. We added seed of various species that were present in this stand of savanna, but not present in a given square meter. And we added, randomly choose which species and how many species to add as seed. And 13 years after we added them, we had a simple straight increase in the number of these added species that were coexisting in these plots in proportion to what we added. And we also had no change in the number of pre-existing species in the plot. So these species were able to invade, grow, persist, and we had no evidence that they ever drove down the diversity of the established species. So we were able to almost double diversity in that system just by adding species. Well, sitting in the front row here is Dean Gaines, and here's a paper that Dean Gaines wrote along with Joe Sachs and Jim Brown, which was very important in leading me to ask the question I'll be asking after this. They saw that something very similar, and I don't remember if yours or mine came out first, I have no idea. I don't remember, we don't remember, we're old. But it doesn't really matter, because there were totally different ways of thinking about the world. They looked at islands in the Pacific, oceanic islands, and asked how many species were on them before Europeans came, and how many more species have invaded, and what happened to the existing species when there are all these invasions. And if you sort of look at the numbers here, the established species, the number that went extinct when this number of species invaded, you can see that the diversity of plants in these islands basically doubled. And during that doubling, 3.3% of the established species were lost. We don't know why they were lost. They might have been lost because of displacement. Might have been some other force. But in essence, invaders doubled diversity on these islands with very minimal impact on the established species. So again, it looks like species are able to coexist when they're brought into contact. Even species, in this case, that evolved in totally different realms and then invaded a common island place. So another interchange is what's called the Great American Interchange. This is migration of plants and animals between North and South America that happened about 3.5 million years ago when a series of volcanoes joined together what had until that time been two totally separated continents. South America, you might remember, used to be hooked to Africa and Australia and India and broke free from that about 100 million years ago and started moving over. And North America was also breaking and moving over. They weren't touching, organisms weren't able to move back and forth until about, well, some of them were able to swim the distance when it got closer. But most of them started moving over about 3.5 million years ago. The point I want to make from this is that there were an incredible number of mammals from each continent that moved to the other continent, and there are almost no extinctions. 3.5 million years later, right up until, well, you might wonder, no extinctions. I mean, you don't see these species living around anymore, right? The 6-foot-tall bird living in southern Florida that could tear your head off. It's that not at Disneyland. There were no extinctions until the Pleistocene extinction that happened about 10,000 years ago, which is associated both with climate change and humans having the closest point to hunt. A very sharp rock that could let you throw a spear or put an arrow through a large animal. When humans had that technology, we drove every mammal in North America basically bigger than about a dog extinct, with a couple exceptions. Until then, for 3.5 million years, these things had invaded from one realm to another and coexisted with taxa that they had never before experienced in their evolutionary history. Totally evolutionary separate for 100 million years. Maybe 80 million years, I don't remember exactly. But now, there are many other cases. I reviewed all of the cases of migration among realms. Trees that migrated from North America to South America, trees from Africa to South America, mammals that invaded North America from Asia, that invaded the other way back to Asia from North America. Lots of invasions that happened in marine ecosystems. There used to be a big ocean in what's the middle part of the United States, the Midwest, and that ocean had a big invasion of marine invertebrates from the Pacific. And during and after this invasion, there's no evidence of any change in extinction rates, even though diversity went up about 50% from the marine invertebrate invasion. The Bering Strait mollusk invasion was much the same way, another massive invasion. 200-some species of mollusks went from the North Pacific to the North Atlantic into a community that only had about 30 species of mollusks, and none of those 30 went extinct. They're still there now, 3 million years later. And other trans-equatorial invasions and so on. And if you read what paleontologists say about these things, it's pretty interesting. So Flannery, talking about the mammal invasion between America and Asia, one might have expected successive waves of immigration would have caused immediate extinction of some of the older lineages. Although this is rarely the case. Instead, the new invaders and the longer established fauna often coexist for a considerable period, only for both to suffer dramatic extinctions as global temperatures drop. And also when humans came in, he didn't mention. But he was sort of getting on to climate change politics at that time. And then the Bering Strait molluscan migration, the same thing Gary Germain talking about, this dramatic migration of 200-some species from the North Pacific to the North Atlantic. Although biotic interchanges may have very important consequences for species in the recipient biota, extinction is an unlikely consequence. So here we have competing species that invade with this incredible diversity of the world. New species appear in North America, they move into Asia, they coexist with what's there. Diversity goes up in both realms. In Asia, they diversify more, and some of them move back to America. Horses did this. And they still coexist when they come back in. Over and over again, these migrations and speciation events happen, and the rule that goes on in the paleontological literature is things coexist. So, what does that imply? Well, I told you to understand how things coexist, there have to be trade-offs. To understand why predators and their prey, or whatever, competitors, anything coexist or trade-offs. This is looking at competitive trade-offs. And in essence, what I can't take the time to explain to you, because Steve would make me charge you a lot of tuition, is this. Is this really specialized patented knowledge. Along that trade-off curve, any point in that curve represents an organism, a species, with a certain suite of traits. And any point you choose, and which would then make a line here that describes the resource requirements of the species, no matter what point you choose in that line, if that species invades, the mathematics says it will be able to coexist with every other species that is there. As long as they fall along the same curve there, labeled T1, the same trade-off curve. Something very different happens, though, if there's been evolution in one realm that wasn't kept up with by evolution in another realm. If organisms coming from a new realm have a superior trade-off service, if they've broken through the trade-off that is in the first realm, such as here T2, where they can live on less resource, less of resource 1 and less of resource 2 than any of the species of the first realm, when one of those invades, they can drive many species extinct. When many of them invade, they should in theory drive everything extinct. So the only way you can explain the millions and millions of years of coexistence that we've seen in the fossil record after major interchanges is if these interacting species that evolved in totally separate realms have the same underlying trade-off. They're better at something and worse at something else on however complex the surface is in the same exact quantitative way as species from all other realms. And you can calculate from how long things coexist what the maximum possible difference could be for all the different invasion events I've labeled here and analyzed in a paper that came out in the American Naturalist last year. And the maximum difference between those trade-off curves is about 0.08%. Absolutely trivial. That's the biggest difference it could be until these things coexist. So what I would assert is that everything that we see about life on Earth says that organisms have trade-offs. They're good at some things, but necessarily worse at other things. And as life evolved on Earth, this trade-off surface became more and more populated with species. Now imagine an economy where you have one company and nothing else. You can ask how stable or how productive might that economy be. And clearly there are companies that are good at doing one thing and worse at doing something else. This is much like, imagine each species here is sort of like a corporation that's doing some job, is making a product that people want and need and pay for. And what this basically says is that as life has been evolving, this trade-off surface is becoming more and more filled with organisms, each of which has its own specialized thing that it does so well that nothing else can get rid of it. But at a cost that it can't do something else's job, if you will, very well at all. That's why they coexist with each other. Well, that says that what we view as evolution of life on Earth isn't so much what you may have thought of from intro biology, things evolving to get better and better and better. What they do, they evolve, at least for the last 400 million years since the ordination, the first data we have for these invasions. They evolve to be different, but they're still bound to the same trade-off. So they're better at one thing, worse at something else. Now, that means, as the world has become more and more diverse, this whole range of trade-offs that sort of define all the different roles that an organism can play in an ecosystem, that whole trade-off surface has become more and more full. I wanted to go through this detail to get to this point, because I want you to consider the possibility that the rest of what I'm going to show you is much more general than you would surmise from it being done at one or a few sites around the world. That we're looking next at what the effect of how full this trade-off surface is on how ecosystems function. What I'm asserting is that life on Earth, for these species that coexist as they are, that it means they're on the same trade-off surface, and there's wonderful mathematics as well as experiments when things are bound to the same trade-off surface. that you can use to predict mathematically and experiments to test experimentally what effects having changes in diversity has on how these ecosystems function. So here are what ecologists used to look like. This was one of the most famous ecologists of his era, Charles Elton, an Oxford ecologist, wrote a fabulous book, 1958, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. I never know why he put animals first, but I guess I looked on plants. And in this book, he proposed, in the way that it was done then, no mathematics, no experiments, just what he thought he'd seen in traveling around the world, that he thought he'd seen that systems that had greater diversity were more stable, fewer species invaded them, and they had less disease. And that was an idea that was out there, but it was not very widely received. I don't have time to do the whole history of this. There was a big debate in the early 1970s, and ecologists concluded then that diversity did not matter. Is that a fair step? In fact, when I first started doing work, when I tried to publish this paper, many reviewers reminded me that diversity did not matter. Many people wrote comments about this work, claiming that I was deluded by my desire to save biological diversity, to believe that it actually mattered and affected how systems operated. There's this big debate, and I was sort of the target of lots of slings and arrows of outrage. Ecologists who had learned when they were grad students, diversity did not matter. So here's the thing that led us to start looking at diversity again, even though I also had read these papers and knew the mathematics and knew diversity shouldn't matter too, just there was no data at that time, just math. So I was following a series of a couple hundred plots in grasslands in Minnesota, and I knew what was happening in year after year after year, how abundant each species was and how productive the whole system, each of those plots was. And then we had a drought. A major drought, the worst drought that we had in the last 100 or so years, the third worst drought in the 180-year geological history of Minnesota. And I saw something in the data I didn't believe, and so I didn't publish that 1988 drought. I didn't publish this until 1994. I just didn't believe it. What I saw was this: was that the plots that had the most species in them had their biomass fall to about half of what it had been before the drought, whereas plots that had fewer species, down here 1, 2, 3, and 4, had their biomass fall to an eighth or a tenth or a 12th of what it had been before the drought. So the highly diverse plots had their biomass fall in half. The other ones had them fall by about a factor of 5 more. So the really low diversity plots basically looked like almost dead ground. Almost nothing grew. And the high diversity plots looked less productive than normal, but very, very different than the low diversity ones. Well, suffice it to say, we had no reason a priori to expect this to have happened. It was against everything we do as ecologists. I then did a whole series of analyses on these data. We had measured a large number of variables. I tried to find any other variable of the several hundred we had measured that got rid of this relationship. Not a single one of them did. And then a colleague of mine, a really good statistician, John Downing, and I decided to send this off to Nature. They published it, and thus began the debate. So, now mathematics. After we saw this happening, we wondered what might cause these systems with more species to be more stable. And we played with a whole variety of models. And this is the simplest one because we can write an analytical closed form solution to it. I'm just proving that the numbers exist. I'm going to show you a graph that sort of shows you what this says. What happens with these models, if you have species that have trade-offs that are competing with each other, and you ask what is the effect of diversity, the number of species, on stability, if you look at the stability of the sum of all the species, the total biomass produced, you find that this model predicts that stability should be almost a linearly increasing function of the number of species. More diverse systems should be more stable. It also predicts something else, and that is that how productive the system is should also increase with diversity. Here it goes from about 250 to 450 or so, maybe an 80 or so % increase in productivity is also predicted as diversity goes from low levels to high levels. And there are a variety of reasons why both of these effects occur. So that was sort of a theoretical prediction that we had, and we were doing this theory at the same time we were planting an experiment. And here's the experiment. It occupies about 20 acres. There are 152 plots in here that we planted out different numbers of species. All of them are perennial prairie grassland species. 1 species, 2, 4, 8, or 16 different species. We randomly chose which species would go into each plot, so each plot was a separate random choice of species. We did that because we could then average across all of the single species plots and ask on average how do monocultures perform. Then we'd ask on average for those same species, randomly chosen 2 at a time, how do systems with 2 species of them perform, or 4 species, or 8 or 16 species. What is the effect, not of which species are there, but averaging across many, many random compositions, what is the effect of the total number of species on the functioning of these systems? So here I'm just, for clarity, I'm reducing this to the mean production at 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16 species for 3 different years. 1996, we planted the experiment in 94. By 96, these prairie planters or long-lived perennials were, the first year they were that tall and they had deep root systems. By 1996, they were normal height of prairie plants. They're basically now mature plants. And in 1996, there was a significant increase in production going from the average monoculture plot to the average 16 species plot. That's about a 70% higher productivity in 16 species than in monoculture. So we published that in Science, and it also led to a lot of discussion, let's say. Again, it wasn't something that was within the realm of how we thought ecology worked at that time. And then we follow this experiment is still running today. You can see what happened by the year 2000 with the green dots. And it made us about 180% greater productivity in 16 species plots than in monocultures. And now, last year's data, 2011, we have a 240% greater production in the highest diversity plots than the monocultures. So the monocultures are going up slightly, but the more diversity there is, the greater is the increase in production from the beginning of this experiment. So not only did diversity immediately cause greater production, but that effective diversity has been growing through time in these experiments. Now, another issue, if you're, let's say you're a land manager, and maybe all you care about is how much biomass can I harvest. You can look at all the species we grew in monoculture, and the blue line here shows the average biomass of the species which had the highest biomass from growing in monoculture. And you compare that to the 16 species plots, you can see that the mean of the 16 species plots is quite a bit higher than that upper bound, the single best species growing in monoculture. And this basically says that as long as you grow these things under the same conditions, at least, which is what we're doing here in roughly the experiment, that there's a real advantage, not just of diversity compared to the typical average species growing by itself, but compared even to the best species growing by itself. And ecologists and agriculturalists call this over-yielding, that there is greater yield than you could ever have expected based upon the traits of each of those individual species, at least by just looking at how much they produce. And this was associated with a big decrease, or a big, increase in how much of the limiting soil nutrient, nitrate, was being used. This is a concentration of nitrate left unexploited that wasn't taken up by the plant roots. And you can see, there's a lot of noise. It's a very noisy thing to measure. You only get a little tiny soil sample out of a big plot. Still, there's a very significant trend with about 60 or 70% lower concentration of nitrate in these 16 species plots than in monoculture plots. Since then, we've done other work in which we found not only this is a concentration in the upper soil, we've now measured through the full soil depth, and we find in mixtures of high diversity that plants shift where their roots are. Some species put their roots deeper, but a better competitor where nutrients has roots in the shallow part of the soil. And not only do they drive nitrate to lower levels, but they also drive it to lower levels through a much larger volume of soil. High diversity mixtures, besides driving or using nutrients more efficiently, also use a greater proportion of the nutrients in the soil by exploiting a greater volume of soil beneath the surface. We looked at invasions. Since Elton had talked about invasions and what happened with invasions, we looked at what happened with diversity and invasions. And here is how many things invaded monocultures. In some of the species in monocultures, like the LP is a legume, Lupinus perennis lupin, it has legumes fixed nitrogen. It had very high concentrations of nitrate living in the soil where it was living. And it also had very high biomass of weedy species that invaded its plot, which we would then pull out to keep the plot in monoculture. So we would weigh what we pulled out, all the weeds invaded. And so basically the species that were able to drive soil nitrate to the lowest level, which are these grasses down here on this end. AG is called big blue stem. It's a major dominant grass in the prairie. Were able to drive nitrate to low levels. They also help prevent invasion by many species into those plots. And here's some more data on a log scale about invasion. So basically Elton was right. More diverse systems actually really do slow invasion by exotic species. It increases the number of species that invade as well as the abundance of those invading species. Now, stability. The first data I showed you that suggested that more diverse systems were more stable, more resistant to drought, weren't a real diversity experiment. They were plots that differed in the number of plant species for reasons totally dependent upon other variables. They were in different fields and they had different rates of nitrogen being supplied. There were many reasons for anyone who read that first paper to have questions about it. And we had questions when we published it. We listed many of them in the paper. Here, though, is a case in which we didn't have a drought. We just looked at, we had 10 years of pretty normal weather during the first 10 years of our biodiversity experiment. But there was enough variation from cool, wet years to warm, dry years and so on, that we had some variation in biomass. And we could then look at how stable this biomass was, how stable the productivity of each plot was in relation to how many species were in it. And there's a significant tendency for more diverse plots to be more stable, which is to say that the productivity of these highly productive, high diverse plots had less variation from one year to the next compared to the productivity of the low diversity plots. So the low diversity plots had lower means as well as greater variation around that compared to the high diversity plots. So I mentioned this surprising effect of time on how productive these plots were. That there's a 70% or so productivity benefit from diversity in the first year after the plots were established, but that grew up to a 240% increase. This is something that none of us had ever expected. In fact, the mathematics said you should get 70 to 80% more production at high diversity from the simple models I played with at the start. Nothing like 240% is even conceivable in the mathematics of those models based on what we thought was happening in the system. Well, the one thing about experiments is you set them up, and these kind of experiments, you let them run a long time, and lots of surprising things happen. And here's one of the biggest surprises to us. This shows what happened to the amount of carbon in the soil. So this is the amount of carbon that was taken out of the air as carbon dioxide and made into organic matter that's building up year after year in the soil. We had no net storage of organic carbon in the monoculture plots. And one of the sort of famous poster children for biofuels is switchgrass. Panicum virgatum. That's the green dot there. We've not yet seen it store any carbon in the soil of these plots. On the other hand, over here in the high diversity plots, we're storing about 2.5 or so tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere every year, stored as organic matter, year by year by year, in the soils of these highly diverse plots. So that's a service that some society might value at some time, I hope, because this is one way that we can remove some atmospheric CO2 and have it stored in the long-term reservoir in soils. Soils, you might know, are the largest biologically active terrestrial sink, if you will, or carbon, or source, depending on what you're doing with the soil. We also looked at diseases in these plots. We saw another thing which Elton has suggested, that this is the incidence of disease in the form of our common plants in the plots. These are fungal, foliar fungal diseases. And there is this very dramatic drop in disease incidence as you go from monoculture to higher diversity plots. So there's greater production, maybe because of soil nitrogen, maybe because of exploitation of soils more effectively, but also maybe because there's less disease in higher diversity plots. And we're exploring that now by some fungal removal experiments. We also saw something intriguing. We set these plots up, and whatever is going to invade these plots as far as non-plant species, we let it invade. So we've had over 500 species of insects that have come into these plots. And we've counted them, how abundant they are, identified them as species and everything else, and identified them into what they do. And basically there are herbivorous insects which eat these plants, then there are their predators or their parasitoids, things which eat those herbivores. And the relative number of species of those two groups is the first part of this graph over here. That's a flat line. It doesn't really change much in response to the number of plant species. But the abundance of these two groups does. When we go to the most species-rich plots, we have food webs that are dominated by predators. And those predators keep the herbivorous insects at low abundances. So there's less insect herbivory, less feeding on the plants by insects in these high diversity plots because of the shift in the structure of these food webs in response to plant diversity. So, if you sort of look at what we have seen here, we've seen diversity provides lots of benefits in these plots. Greater productivity, greater stability of that productivity, there's greater, more efficient nutrient use. That more efficient nutrient use means that the groundwater which leaves these plots is cleaner, purer. Basically, water that we like to drink has in it whatever is left over, with whatever was not taken up by whatever ecosystem that water was filtered through. And these highly diverse ecosystems are very good at removing nutrients, which means that the water that leaves them has very low levels of nutrients in it and is therefore of a higher quality for human use. We also saw lower disease incidence in high diversity, less invasion into those highly diverse systems. And all of these things, the mathematics we've done from our studies of why species coexist in nature, all of these things happen because these organisms have trade-offs. They're better at one thing and worse at something else. If species did not differ from each other, diversity would not matter. The only reason diversity matters is that species have different suites of traits. They have different things in the world that they do well. And the summation of all the things that they do well is what causes these various ecosystem properties to emerge in these high diversity systems. It's unlike Shakespeare, who said, "The evil that men do lives after them, but the good is often tarred with their bones. So let it be for Caesar." Well, here, the good that these organisms do is what really matters. What they're bad at is irrelevant. It's the same thing as for your lives, right? Find out what you're good at and do it. And that's sort of the essence of what all other organisms do, and maybe we should, as humans, listen to that little bit of advice. But for the students here wondering what's ahead of your life, just follow that simple advice. So, I might become a preacher too. This is So, this is a paper that came out in Nature. Now, this is sort of shifting gears. I showed you experimental results. There are two main varieties of rice that are grown around the world. There's the varieties of rice that are fairly dry. When you cook them, they don't really stick together very much. Then there are other varieties of rice that have a lot more gluten-like protein in them that are very sticky. And the trouble with the sticky variety of rice, which is nutritionally better, is that it's very susceptible to fungal diseases. And so to grow that sticky variety of rice, it is very common to use fungicides on the crop as it's growing. And this is an experiment that was set up first on a few little acres in China that then spread across this whole rice growing region, where somebody discovered that if you would plant a row of normal rice, which is resistant to disease, next to a row of the variety of rice which is susceptible to disease, and then again a row of resistant back and forth, that would move, that sort of doubles the diversity from one species to two. Higher diversity, I already showed you, leads to less disease. It leads to less disease for a very simple reason. These diseases have to spread from one susceptible individual to another. If you have a solid field of rice, all the neighbors of an infected plant are susceptible. When you have these adjacent rows, the only ones that are susceptible are going away from you in this, pretty quickly in this long line, and lots of the other ones around you are resistant to that disease. And this disease had a low enough rate of spread that just putting these alternating rows of resistant and susceptible rice was sufficient to get rid of the disease. And by doing that, farmers saved the human expense of being exposed to the fungicide, the environmental effects of having that go throughout their water and everything else, as well as the economic cost of doing it. And once this was sort of shown on a local scale, it just spread across this region of rice growing in China. It's using biological diversity to increase yields. Now, China does another thing in agriculture I think is very interesting. There's a lot of intercropping. It was a traditional way of growing foods. It basically takes advantage of differences in the resource requirements of different crop plants. And about 20% of the total grain and legume yield in China is attributed to over-yielding from intercropping. Basically having the right varieties next to each other. The simple story are plants like legumes that fix nitrogen and plants which don't. But there also is a lot of intercropping, overyielding that comes from having a plant which grows better at the beginning of the year, the cool part, versus in the hot heat of the summer. Plants that have different rooting depths. Some plants emit organic acids in the soil that break down rock in the mineral form of phosphorus into phosphate that then can be taken up by the plants. And that then not only helps them, but other plants in the rows next to it that have roots in the same soil get more phosphate. And so as there are more and more studies on it, there are an incredible number of mechanisms whereby using biological diversity in agriculture, only going from 1 to 2 crops, maybe 3 at the most, gives a pretty good return. 20% more yield is actually a lot more yield for a farmer. It's a lot more profit for a farmer. Since there are fixed costs when you farm, you have to overcome those fixed costs to make any profit. 20% more beyond what broke even gives you quite a bit more profit. So I think there's some things that can be done there. And there's something called quirks and quacks or quartz and something like this that Canadian Broadcasting puts on. I did an interview for them on their Good News Before Christmas Eve show about what we could do that was really exciting in agriculture. I mentioned this work. I got a letter from a farmer in Saskatchewan who said that he has been growing intercropping of his major crops on over 10,000 acres now. It has much higher yield from it. I can go visit this guy this coming summer to see what it actually looks like. But this would be amazing for any agriculture around the world, and definitely for developed countries where we have so much been dependent upon very high inputs, often inefficiently used, to get high yields. The Chinese get high yields with less input by doing intercropping. So that's now I'm sort of switching over. This is sort of using biological diversity. I've showed you that biological diversity has huge effects on systems. I'm now suggesting ways it could be used by the world. This is using biological diversity to make biofuels. And this is looking at how effective biofuels are in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As you probably know, corn ethanol is a total waste. Okay, if you didn't know that, I'll tell you more. Soybean biodiesel is a real waste, unless of course you use waste oil that's being thrown away. If you use waste, if you go and pick up the grease at McDonald's and make your car run, that's tremendous. But this is using the soybeans in your car before it goes to McDonald's. So this is just we've written quite a few papers on biofuels and how you might do them right. It turns out there are an incredible number of ways to do them wrong and not very many to do them right. But doing them right really involves how you grow the biomass. You have to grow it on land that's not good for agriculture, and you have to grow it in a way where you get storage of carbon in the soils. And we found one way which does that from our biodiversity experiments. And when you do that, you can have biofuels that are massively carbon negative. When you're done making and burning the biofuel, there's less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there had been before. And where is it? It's being stored in the soils by those highly diverse mixtures. So I want to now go to one last point to sort of show you how important biological diversity is. This is a comparison across a whole variety of experiments we've been doing at our research site in Minnesota for the last 30 or so years. We've manipulated just about anything that an ecologist imagined might affect these grassland ecosystems. We've nitrogen, fire, vapor, water, warming, CO2, you name it, we've manipulated it. Here's the simple point. This shows the magnitude of response that we see from changing a system from having high diversity, 16 species per square meter, to being a monoculture, 1. That's the change in biomass. Or from going from 16 species to 4, or from fertilizing with nitrogen, something farmers do and people do managing lands to try to get more yield. There's how much more yield you get by fertilizing. Here's how much more you get by changing diversity. This one's a lot cheaper. Here's how much you lose to herbivores. Here's what happens. Here's how much more you get from warming, from added CO2, from fire, and drought and so on. Basically, of all the things we've manipulated, frankly, incredibly much to my surprise, the biggest variable we've ever found that affects productivity as well as soil carbon and soil nitrogen levels in our grassland ecosystems is the number of species, biological diversity. It is much more of a keystone variable in ecology than I ever imagined it would be. Now, I showed you graphs that show the difference between 1 species and 16. There are 5 million species. Why would I even tell you this? Right? If all it takes is 16. You probably all been wondering this since you're good, curious, critical scientists. You know, why is he telling us about 16 species mattering after he just told us there were 5 million species on Earth? Well, the 5 million species that are on Earth have limited parts of Earth where they can live. They don't all live everywhere, with maybe the exception of bracken fern. That, I think it really is the best exception that I know of. And I'm talking about the number of species that are in a small local area, as in our experimental plots, where each individual is interacting with other individuals around it. And what we see is we have to have about 16 species in the square meter interacting in these plots to have them have the high level of functioning that I'm showing. The question is, if you're not managing and planting in the exact right 16 species that live in a certain plot of soil, if you go out to nature, how many species you have to have on a larger scale to have a typical square meter have 16 grassland species in it? Well, this is data from our research site. To have, to have 10 species per square meter requires that we have 71 species in a half a hectare. This is, we've gone out and counted species in larger and larger and larger and larger areas. That's what this data comes from. If you want to expand this out, the Great Plains have about 3,000 species in it. I don't remember the area of the Great Plains, but it falls exactly on the same line that is shown in the log line. I guess it's not log, on that line. The number of species throughout the whole Great Plains, these 3,000 or so grassland species that live in the Great Plains, basically give the average square meter of the Great Plains around 16 to 20 species. So the numbers I've been talking about are how many species it takes within a little local site, but it takes many, many, many more species than that on a broader scale to assure that local sites have that number of species and function in the way that that diversity drives them to be. Now that's sort of what diversity does. I want to get to the next part of this, which is what is happening to diversity and why I asserted at the beginning that the loss of biological diversity is an issue which I think is in the long term as serious as climate change for the future sustainability of Earth and the people on Earth. Well, right now, there are about 8.5 billion hectares of land on Earth that are suitable for humans. That gets rid of Antarctica, which is land. It gets rid of tundra and desert. And we use a little over 5 billion out of 8.5 billion for crops and grazing land right now. We're going to need about 1 billion more for crops in the next 50 years. So basically, of that 3 or so billion that we're currently unused, we'll be using about a third of it for crops. That does not count land that goes into other things, urbanization, everything else. That's pretty small compared to the demand for crops. That does not, though, include the possibility we might try using some of that land or much of that land to grow biofuels, to have biofuel crops to replace petroleum. As I said, it's pretty hard to grow a biofuel crop and actually have it be greenhouse gas beneficial. It doesn't include forestry. As there are more people and people are richer, they consume more wood products, which means there are going to be more forest cut for wood products. And if they're managed properly, right now that means they're managed to be monocultures. So we've taken diverse forests and turned them into monocultures. We don't know if the same things that happen in grasslands as we change diversity happen in forests. But I would assert the same underlying biology is occurring. You have organisms which coexist with each other, which have the diversity they do have in forest systems because of trade-offs that these organisms have. They're better at one thing, they're worse at something else. That should cause the same dependence of various aspects of the functioning of forest ecosystems on diversity as we see in our grassland experiments. And then we have diversity also threatened by both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem pollution. Nutrients of various kinds added to both systems greatly reduce the number of species that can live and coexist in those systems by eliminating these niche axes, which differences which these species have evolved, which let them coexist and be specialized or disappear when you add these nutrients. So the question is, what's going to happen as we head toward 9 or 10 billion much richer people? What's going to happen to biological diversity in the world? Well, if we do nothing, we are definitely heading toward what many people say is possibly the biggest extinction event since a meteor hit the world at the KT boundary, causing dinosaurs to go extinct 65 million years ago. I'm not quite that pessimistic, maybe only half as big as that. So there's one idea out there, and I really want, I was hoping to have, I didn't realize it'd be quite so big a room. I was actually thinking of little people around a round table, but anyway, this is fun. I would love all of your thoughts, no matter how many of you are here. One of the ideas that is out there to try to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, a lot of greenhouse gas emission comes from deforestation and from farming lands, is this something called reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. It's called RED. It's a popular but controversial idea. It basically says you go to a country and you pay them not to cut down forest. And what does that do? Someone, let's say you want to build a house, and one country's not selling you lumber. Where do you go buy your lumber?
Home Depot.
Home Depot. Another country is the right answer. So, there are world markets for food, for energy, for building products, for basically everything we eat. Products are made one place, shipped around the world. And it'd be wonderful to imagine that by buying a piece of land, not only could we save that land, but we wouldn't be causing some other piece of land someplace else to be cleared and converted to whatever uses would be demanded by the marketplace. But I think that's a very naive assumption for one to make. If that actually were true, the people would be hurt most would be the poorest people in the world. I would say it was an inequitable solution to the problem, or in some sense an immoral solution to the problem, not just an impractical solution. So the only thing I've been able to come up with, I'd love your thoughts on this. I can't see that the way we're proposing to do RED right now is ever going to work. The only way I can see to do this is to attack the issue the other way. And that is to have ways that as more lands become forest lands, have those lands be managed to maximize their productivity, which means there won't have to be as much land converted. And maybe one good way to manage productivity is to keep them in highly diverse forests and do selective logging on those forests, not clear cutting. That might work. I'm not a forester. I don't know whether this will really work, but some of you maybe can go out and spend your lives finding out if this works, and if so, you can really save a lot of the world's biological diversity. The other point is land. And I talked about this last year on the agricultural side. About half of all the land cleared on Earth has yields less than a quarter of what those lands could have, based on the soil and the climate and modern technology. They have horrible yields because the people in those countries don't have money to feed themselves and their family, much less money for seed, for implements, fertilizer, irrigation, pest control, and so on. They don't have knowledge. I think our most recent analysis on all these cultural, social, political variables and input variables that influence yields in the poorer countries of the world is that there's a very strong interaction between two variables, nitrogen application and education. Applying nitrogen gives you a bit more yield. Education gives a bit more yield. The two of them combined give massively higher yield. The countries which have people who are educated and have inputs are the ones that get really high yields. Inputs by themselves, hand out a bag of fertilizer, nobody knows how to use it, doesn't do much good. Education by itself without a bag of fertilizer doesn't do any good either. The two of them together have massive inputs, have massive impacts on yields. So, I guess that is the end. So that's sort of where I am. I'd love to hear your thoughts about any of this, but especially your thoughts about what we can do now that I hope I've convinced you that biological diversity really is of great importance to society, to save it for all future generations. Thank you. Okay, so I'm glad your first point you made it, because I didn't say a very important point. I showed you cases of species invading that would be competitors with existing species. We have had cases, we've basically lost the chestnut tree in North America when the new disease invaded. We lost elm when the new disease invaded. When predators, pathogens, diseases of various sorts invaded the realm, they can have huge impacts. There's no evidence of that in the fossil record, but that might be very hard to see in the fossil record. I mean, we do have evidence of very large predators, and the only seeming negative impact of the invasion of South America is attributed to the invasion of predators, which one author said, the likes of which the South American mammals had never before experienced. And some animals did go extinct, attributed to predation, not to competition. So I want to first make that point. It's not as if there's a totally benign world and everything that invades will have no impact. The impact I was talking about wasn't also the abundance of the species. Abundances do change when there are more species present, and some species go down a lot. I was amazed though, because I was sure, I'd even written a paper. I was given this award by the Ecological Society. I was given the right to write anything I wanted in a paper. And I had this wonderful theory in this paper that showed how when species invaded from another realm, that the new realm, if it were bigger and had been around longer and had more time for things to evolve in it, should be superior, they would come in and wipe everything out, and all this wonderful math and so on. It was wrong, totally, completely, wonderfully, delightfully wrong. Which actually is fun in science. Now, GMOs, we depend for 60% of our calories globally on 3 crops, corn, wheat, and rice. And I don't think any of those crops is any further away from being unusable for us than, let's say, the chestnut tree was, or the elm tree was, and so on. So all it takes is one novel disease, which they've never experienced before, that they can't overcome, and we lose the crop. That would be devastating. I think in the very long term, having the ability to use genes from other plants to help fight diseases in crop plants would be very important for us to keep sustainably being able to produce so much food and so little pool of genetic diversity, 3 species. I really have a hard time imagining that we're going to somehow appropriately engineer enough species to fill in all the holes left by extinction. And these are the result of a long, long time period. When we engineer organisms, we don't even know how to turn the genes off. We put this Bacillus thuringiensis protein into corn, and then it gets expressed in the pollen and kills pollinators. It kills things that eat the pollen, I should say. They're actually been pollinators. It gets expressed all over the whole plant. We don't know how to turn the genes on and off in different tissues. We're really naive in how we do it. It's a very crude tool right now. You know, we're crushing an ant with a sledgehammer right now. And we'll become better and better at it through time. I'm sure this is how technology advances. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that. I have a hard time imagining we're going to be wise enough and good enough to actually replace the things that we're producing that way. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting lecture. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you about what we can do, because that's my ideas that I want to share with you and check in with you. I'm really interested in the increase in the benefit from 1 to 16 species from the 1994 paper, or rather from the first few years up until the 2011 data. What's your sense of where that comes from? Is that because it takes time for species to sort themselves out in terms of their locations and the structure of their roots, et cetera, to exploit the complementarity?
Well, I really think there are many things happening simultaneously. One of the things we want to do is to tease apart our long-term data set to see whether we can ascribe what proportion of the change in productivity we can ascribe to different variables. So part of it, and maybe the biggest part, I think, comes from the increased soil fertility we've had from accumulating carbon and nitrogen. Part of it comes from disease resistance. Part of it probably does come from sorting out. It does take these plants a long time to build up. These are long life plants. These things live 50, 100 or more years. So they're really like trees that are just that drop their leaves totally above ground. So it does take a long time for them to fully exploit the soil resources. There may be probably some shifting as to where individuals are and who their neighbors are that has a big influence on this. So all those things do take time. I don't know how much longer that increase will keep going. I was surprised to see it as much an increase as we actually had this year compared to 4 or 5 years ago.
Sorry, thanks.
Adding on to that, are you seeing an increase in atmospheric nitrogen deposition for the cells?
Yeah, we've looked at N deposition hasn't really changed much at our sites. No. We look at it. We've done lots of nitrogen addition experiments and so on, trying to mimic the effects of it. But the actual rate, the big increases in N deposition are going to happen in the developing countries, in which before they have fertilizer industry are very low rates, and then they're going to shoot up with agriculture and high temperature combustion and fossil fuels. Yeah.
You said that all life kind of exists on the same trade-off surface. How do you account for plant plasticity or polyploidy?
Well, polyploids are almost instant speciation if they're viable. And a lot of the diversity we see isn't polyploids. So you have to ask, so a polyploid has multiple copies of a chromosome. And it gives them some unique traits. But making chromosomes have cost and trade-offs. What I would say is the assertions that I'm making about this universal trade-off circuit have to basically go down to cell biology and not us. They have to be based upon 2 billion years of evolution of microscopic organisms progenitors of our current plants and animals, and the physiology that they had at the end of that time. So you think about a microorganism that can divide once a day or 2 or 3 times a day, 2 billion years can have to stretch on its physiology, its biochemistry, molecular biology, and so on. Probably has a time to give just about all the things learned that occur at that level. Beyond that level, it comes down to how's that physiology used, which genes are expressed, which ones aren't expressed. Every time you make a new protein, you put amino acid in it that can't go into some other protein. When you allocate phosphorus to a compound, you can't allocate that same phosphorus someplace else. So the trade-offs are there. The trade-offs are at the tissue level of larger organisms. Carbon that goes into a leaf can't go into a root. Very simple things like this. And those, I think those kinds of unavoidable trade-offs must be what's causing this to happen.
Yeah, so I was an intern at your site about 10 years ago.
Thank you.
And I remember one thing I was very struck by at the time was how much more of an effort it takes to maintain those monoculture plots compared to the 16 species plots, and like how much more time we spent as interns weeding those plots, and how much more biomass we were clearly removing, and how that seems like it kind of biases the experiment in favor of your hypothesis that you can have this intensive weeding of the monoculture plots that you don't have with the other plots. And I was just wondering if, like, now it's, I guess, about 10 years later, if those plots have become more stable, or do they still require like that essentially huge disturbance event every year?
Yeah, it depends. The species with big root systems, like the perennial grasses, have almost no weed species to be done to them, which is probably the first under there a decade ago too. A decade ago, they were still, I think they're still growing a bit, so it could have been happening. The legumes are the ones that are most readily invaded by everything else. And the legume plots are still being weed. And not only are legumes most readily invaded, but legumes are also the best invaders of all other plots. Because legumes have their own source of nitrogen. They can invade a plot with a very efficient nitrogen user present because they just come in and make their own nitrogen. It doesn't matter. So they're both the most invaded as well as the best invaded. You know, that the question you raised has been raised an incredible number of times by people reviewing our papers.
I'm sure.
And yeah, of course.
I was just wondering if it was becoming less of an issue over time.
Well, there is less weeding needed now than 5 or 10 years ago. But as I said, the legume plots still need massive weeding. The only way around that is you can prevent grasses from invading legume plots by using a grass-specific herbicide. And therefore, you can sort of keep them from ever being very big. I just wish I trusted that grass-specific herbicides are really that specific and not affecting the legumes. And so we don't use it. We did it very early on in the experiment. We don't do that anymore.
But you don't quantify this, or you don't measure how much biomass you take out.
Oh, we have. We don't get it all the time. We've done it. We've used that as a correlate. We had strips of plots we never weeded at all. Saw what happened to them. Even though you don't get rid of all the weedy plants, they still have a lot less biomass than the native perennials have. Weedy plants they grow quickly. The price of growing quickly is they have high tissue nitrogen. Which means for every unit of nitrogen taken out of the soil by a weedy plant, it produces about, per gram of nitrogen taken out, it makes about 20 grams of biomass. The C4 grasses are dominant perennial grasses, have 120 grams of carbon made for every gram of nitrogen taken out of the soil. So that difference really means when you have these high diversity mixtures which have those high C to N plants in them, that they have much more yield, even if you don't need that many. But you don't need another monoculture anymore. So that's the trade-off in the experiment.
I have 2 questions. The first is, how did you decide on those initial 16 species? Were they on certain parts of that trade-off axis, or were they randomly sampled from the trade-off?
They were 16, basically most of them species that we could find.
And then my second question was on the red issue, which is primarily a mechanism to conserve carbon. And particularly in tropics, I think the danger with focusing on preserving and constructing carbon biomass stocks on degraded lands or already cultivated lands is that there's some papers that show that you get equivalent biomass stocks in relation to secondary forest species that are a fraction of the number that are in primary forests. And so you could have, well, potential danger, you could have landowners saying, you know, accumulate certain X number of carbon.
Did you rename this? That's good. Having heard the easy stuff on you. Okay. So, yeah, I don't know. The red issue that bothers me is I don't think it actually saves much carbon. You know, all these calculations talk about leakage and so on. Well, this leakage is basically people need those products. They're not getting from that land, they're buying it someplace else. And ultimately, I think leakage is going to end up being close to 100%, in which case nothing is really being done for carbon. And people have spent money without getting any benefit. And I think one of the worst things we can do for society is limited funds is going to invest in the environment that's invested unwisely. And I think red is a very unwise investment. But I don't think it really gives us enough benefit for greenhouse gas reduction in the long term. And you know, you do that, you sell a program like Bren. Many people are quote selling it, are claiming it gives greenhouse gas benefit. What they really want to do is to save the land because it's biological diversity. I agree with both goals, but if that doesn't actually address those goals and solve them in the long term, it doesn't do any good to save a species for 100 years. If we can't save it in a way that'll be around 100,000 years from now, it really doesn't matter very much in the long scheme of it. And that's just not a stable platform, I think, to achieve any of the goals, carbon savings or diversity savings.
One last question, Richard.
Given that excluding anthropogenic sort of crops and plants activity, I guess, do you know if the net equilibrium of biomass or the carbon that's being sequestered into the soil is like a positive, a net positive thing in terms of this natural equilibrium or non-anthropogenic plots? And there's only an acute sort of time phase where that carbon dioxide sequestered in the soil, or will it be released later by like other microbial fermentation or tundra sort of?
Yeah, so that's a good question. How much long-term true carbon storage are you getting? We do know that when we take lands that have, let's say, been in native vegetation and start farming them, we lose about 40% of the carbon that had been stored in that soil. And when you restore them back to what they had been, they slowly build it back up. To me, the question goes a bit beyond what you said is this. Can you manage these lands in ways that you actually have more carbon being stored than would have been stored even in diverse natural systems? And it looks like in our case, we are having that happen because we are imposing a higher abundance of legumes from our experiments than would be there naturally. Legumes are wonderful food for lots of mammals. And with how few mammals there are in many systems now after mass extinction of mammals and human hunting and so on, we have much higher legume densities, we have higher rates of carbon storage, and it looks like we're going to have more carbon stored in these high diversity plots than we have in nearby native vegetation, which doesn't have the legumes in it.
Well, let's give Dave.